So let's take our seats. We have a very interesting topic. Big biotech, where is it going? But big biotech will also involve small biotech and all of biotech. And I have a remarkably distinguished set of panelists who've had a whole host of experiences, which I will not try to repeat. They're all in the material that you got when you came to the meeting. But to my immediate left is Jane GROGAN, and she's Executive Vice President and Head of Research at Biogen. And next to her is Pushkal Gar. And to get this correct, he's the Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President in Development of Medical Affairs at Alnylam. And next to him is Ray DESHAIES. Ray is the Senior Vice President, Global Research Emeritus at Amgen. And next to him is George YANCOPOULOS. I hope I got that right. Close. Good shot. Board co-chair, president, and chief scientific officer of Regeneron. So a lot of experience in the room, all the way from new biotech, only 20 years old, and older biotech, and middle biotech. And I think we'll have a very interesting conversation. Now, I will call on a couple of people with a question, and they will banter back and forth or talk, and then we'll open for dialogue between panelists. And at the end, I'm hoping to have time to invite questions from the room, but it'll depend on time. So let's start thinking back. Genentech was established in 1976 with the aspirations and then fulfillment of becoming a vertically integrated worldwide marketing biotech company quite successfully. 50 years later, the world has changed. There's a lot of large biotech, mid-sized biotech, small biotech. So if you think about innovative new ideas, is the age of the vertically integrated aspiration in biotech history? What's the models for bringing innovation into this community and industry that new idea, a new aspiration appears, and what are the models one should think about, or do you disagree that it can still be the aspiration of a small company or an entrepreneur to develop a vertically integrated, fully functional biotech? So, George, do you want to comment on that? Because you've lived through most of that.
Well, certainly Genentech was our dream and our role model. And I think the whole concept of building a fully integrated, company from beginning to end can solve for a lot of the needs and the problems. But the reason why we aspire to be like Genentech really did not have to do with all the downstream stuff. It had to do with the fact that at the time, they were the leaders in innovation. And that's, I think, what distinguishes success. You need a lot of the downstream capabilities. I think there's other ways to actually handle the downstream capabilities. I actually believe in some cases they could be done, better using collaborations. We actually built our company based on 50-50 collaborations. We've got Chris Wiebacher here from Sanofi. That relationship provided a lot of that downstream vertical integration stuff And without that, we could not have taken things all the way. But it all starts with the innovation. That's what's really hard. That's what's really limiting. So I always think whether it's a project that we're working on or something that we're trying to do with the company, you got to understand what's the hardest thing, what's the true bottleneck, what's really the limitation to success. And it starts with innovation. And that's what's most limiting in the industry. This is the hardest industry to truly innovate in. I mean, innovating an iPhone, that's not innovation. iPhone 16, 17, who the hell cares? What we do is true innovation, and it's quantifiably the hardest thing that human beings try to do. And that's where I think the focus needs to be. The downstream stuff can be useful to have, it can be important to have, it can maximize the value that you create. And so I'm not minimizing, it's incredibly important. But the innovation is where the focus should be, and what we as a society should be figuring out how to much more greatly incentivize for and try to promote through society, let alone in the biotech industry.
Jane?
Is this on? Yes. First off, thank you for having me here in this panel. And as we think about Genentech, we have to think about Biogen, and that's not just because I'm currently head of research there, but sitting next to the founder of that company, which is still the independent pharma established in, 1978, I believe, in the East Coast, that is still existing. So that's quite some accolades. And I know at the time that was also being aimed at building a fully integrated organization. One of the spirits of that company, and I think this gets back to what George was saying, was really driving after innovation and high unmet medical need, and really taking on the challenges of breakthrough medications in really novel and new areas. And that's certainly something we continue to pioneer, I think, as everyone does on this panel as well. Innovation is key. I think you're going to hear that again and again and again at this panel. I think one thing that's changed in the last 4 decades is that not one organization or not one large pharma can actually drive all the innovation within the walls of its company. And you need to look outside. And so the ecosystem is always used and partnered with academic sites where those innovations often happen. But I think we're shifting a few decades later to much more of an equitable ecosystem where who's doing what, how do we integrate with them, how do we work together on ideas so we can grow together in industry. And there are times when there's efficiencies by bringing things in-house because you can streamline things. There are certain platforms that you need to bring in-house. But otherwise, I think a lot of things can be really accessed outside. And I really like the idea of that, 50-50 or even 60-40. How far can we really build efficiencies and then build agile organizations to move our industry forward together?
I want to challenge you because innovation is important, but if you're starting a small firm, you got to have resources, meaning money, and you have to have people. People are really a lot of people trained in this industry now, but the ability to finance a company through A and B round, and then to get resources to develop products that are really innovative takes time. And for Alnylam, which is sitting next to you, which I happen to have a lot of time, it took 10 years. And it took about $1 billion. So are those days, that challenge is really difficult right now.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak a little bit, and thank you also, Phil, and to the Galien Foundation for inviting us to speak. I think, again, getting back to the innovation piece, I think the question is there a better alternative to biotech? And I think, we haven't talked enough about sort of the innovation culture, right? And the culture is the critical part. What we do, as George was saying, is incredibly, incredibly hard. It should be hard, actually, to attract capital to ideas, right? It shouldn't be sort of easy. It should be hard because we're trying to do hard things. And there's a lot of people with interesting ideas. It's not $1 billion all at once, right? It's incremental based on a tenacious team that's able to generate interesting data and do the right experiments to show the value of what they're doing. And I think sort of the model of having, a real proximity between decision makers and the science, having clear accountability on who's making those choices, risk-taking, I think that's a very unique aspect that really fosters that innovative environment. So I think that is the best way. I think, you know, as we, I second, you know, support wholeheartedly the whole point about, you know, partnerships. I mean, Phil, you've been part of that. We've all, you know, with Sanofi, with Regeneron, we've done with the medicines company. So we've built the company based on that. And there's been places where we can actually go it the whole way as we've gotten larger to bring, you know, medicines directly to patients. And there's places where that hasn't made sense for us. And we've done partnerships to do that. So I think now when we think about really some other areas, which is when we think about neglected diseases and rare disease, that's where I think we really do have to think about different models, because I don't know that the current biotech model necessarily supports that as well.
Ray, do you have any comments?
Yeah, you know, there's an interesting point in there you made about the time span of technology development. And I would argue it's even a little bit longer than the number you put on it. So if you look at when a technology first starts being developed in industry to when you have products that are approaching blockbuster status, you're typically in a window of about 15 to 20 years. The first monoclonal antibody, J&J, Mironimab, approved I think in '86. It wasn't until Rituxan crossed the blockbuster threshold in 2002. So that was 16 years for antibodies. Antibody drug conjugates, the first one approved again was in 2000, and it wasn't until the mid-2010s that Kadcyla crossed that barrier. So again, in that 15 to 20 year time range. And you see the same thing with Alnylam. So, you know, the problem is in industry, if you look at people who are leading R&D or people who are leading research, they are not in those jobs for 15 to 20 years. Right? You'll probably have 2, in some cases 3 rounds of turnover. So you're in a very long cycle business with short cycle occupancy of the leadership chairs in that business. And so it's difficult to sustain in a large company that kind of intensity of commitment for that duration of time without a financial return. So I think there's always enormous room in this industry for innovation to be happening in small startup companies that are being financed in other ways. And, you know, part of the problem is biology, you never know how something is going to work or what's going to work. Take genome editing, right? It started with approaches like Sangamo, and then it went on to TALENs, and CRISPR wasn't even discovered yet, right? And so there's so much serendipity in biology that I think you need a it's like evolution, it's like variation selection. That's our industry, variation selection. You have enormous amount of variation created by capital, pension funds, university endowments, funding venture capital. And from that variation, you are going to select the few things that work and then use the muscle of big companies to help drive the clinical trials that you need to do to bring it to market. I just looked the other day for a completely other reason. I'm writing a review, and I looked to see, of the top 10 selling drugs in the world, how many were discovered, how many were invented at the people that are selling them. And I could only find 3, and one of them was dupilumab. And dupilumab, of course, you have a partnership to help you in developing that molecule.
2 of the top 10.
Yeah. Yes.
Invented at Regeneron.
Aflibercept is another one. Yeah. So, you know, I think to me that speaks volumes that, you know, 7 of the top 10 selling drugs in the world were not invented by the people that are selling them.
And I think, if I may, I think that's true in these vertically integrated companies, because the way they got their molecules was not necessarily that they invented them in-house, sorry, George, except for Regeneron, but that there was a mindset around what's the science that you're trying to follow and the question you're trying to answer, and then having that sweet spot of expertise within an organization that could see an opportunity outside with which you could then go and partner with someone or build a molecule together or buy in that asset as well. So that external relationship has always been part of how we've built this, you know, the industry that we're in.
You know, I want to build on a point that Ray said, which I think is incredibly important, about short-term leadership in a long-term business. And it gets back to your point about funding innovation. And I think we should really talk about that to a degree. I mean, we have a real communication problem. I think there should be a lot more incentives, and we're, as a society, talking about actually destroying those incentives right now. But getting back to Ray's point, you know, our story is even longer than Alnylam's. It took us 20 years for our first approval, but then we average 1 approval, including 5 blockbusters, a year, okay, since then, for 15 years. Why? Because we have something that nobody else in the industry has. We've kept our teams together. I'm looking at like Jamie Orengo, who heads our immunology and inflammation group. She looks so young, but she's been 15 to 20 years.
Oh boy,
15
do you
to
know
20
how.
years. And so we all learn together, all of us. We built systems and platforms, and we're using that, and it is reproducible. But the system generally, we can get into, and a lot of it was partnerships, how we survived for 20 years without a product. But what we realize is that the system we now have in society is counterproductive to trying to create the long-term sustainable innovation models that can actually then reproducibly deliver drugs. I mean, I think Alnylam is a great example, but it takes a miracle, it takes a lot of work to just get to that point. And we have to understand the system is broken, and we're doing a terrible job of communicating how important this system is and how we shouldn't be among the top 10 industries, the one that has the worst return overall on investment. I mean, we should be number 1. Why? Because we're addressing the thing that people care about, okay? You know, you care if you lose your iPhone, but if you find out that a loved person has a horrible diagnosis, you care a hell of a lot more, and we're not creating the right system that rewards the right things that we should be rewarding in society.
Okay.
And I think one thing interesting about the Alnylam example is, is that the discovery of N-acetylgalactosamine as being a ligand to get into the liver was absolutely critical for driving success of that platform. But there were major companies that sort of invested in that platform and exited that platform before that discovery was made. And it just took that decade plus to get to the point of making that discovery to really open up the platform.
And a few very good chemists. Okay. What?
We were talking about this a little earlier, chatting over lunch, but you know, there was a comment made earlier on today around there's too many Me Too drugs out there in the industry, but the actual fact is, if something fails, if a medicine fails, it doesn't mean necessarily the target has failed. We've learned that a good old-fashioned antibody targeting a known cytokine, if you do it the right way, it can be transformative. And so the modality matters, and sometimes hanging on and really understanding that the target remains a really important biological target with which to go after, then hanging in there sometimes is really important.
So we've talked about the environment for these innovative companies. If you look forward over the next decade and what's going on in biological science now, what excites you, Pushkal, as to how the industry is going to make a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm going to have anything terribly profound to say other than I think we'd all agree, we're in a remarkable era where, you know, from 30 years ago or so when the Human Genome Project was sort of underway and people felt, somewhat disappointed that we didn't have sort of an immediate return on that investment. But that's actually paying off now. I mean, the work that, you know, Amgen and Regeneron did in terms of building up large genotype-phenotype databases, those insights are now yielding tremendous scientific advances. And so, I mean, we just heard a lot, you know, earlier about, you know, immunology and targeted therapies, cell therapies, but I think where we are with genetically targeted therapies through a variety of modalities, whether it's gene editing, it's siRNA, it's ASOs, it's messenger RNA, all of these things, I think we're in a very, it's a remarkable thing. We actually have molecular scalpels to basically take out one specific, you know, disease-causing gene or protein and perturb the system in a way that will be beneficial to patients. I think that's just a remarkable thing. It forces us to actually, you know, sharpen our game in terms of understanding biology, causal biology in humans, right? Because you're being that precise. And the other, you know, and now we're going to be able to go into more and more tissues as we work on delivery. We'll hopefully find ways to cross the blood-brain barrier, and there'll be combinatorial approaches now for polygenic diseases, I think, increasingly. And then I think the pharmacology of these, these different approaches is also fascinating because most of them are turning out that you can actually give them either once or very, very infrequently. And so I think we have the opportunity to be on the precipice of basically like vaccine-like approaches in the next 10 or 15 years for some chronic diseases. And so that's really a remarkable opportunity that I think we have in front of us. If we can really harness all the power and intellect that we have in science to make a big difference. So I think it's going to be really revolutionary over the next 10 or 15 years.
Ray?
All right. I just submitted a review last week to Nature Reviews Drug Discovery, and maybe one of you in the audience is a reviewer, so I'm going to give you a plug. Maybe it'll help my review get accepted. So I am really excited by what I see as a broad advance in our ability to make what I would call multi-specific molecular medicines. So these are drugs that work by contacting two or more things, either simultaneously or sequentially. And where contacting two or more things is fundamental to their mechanism of action. And what we've seen is a major upswing in those kind of drugs. So I just did an analysis of this in 2017, 2018. My first 2 years in industry, there were 105 NMEs approved by the FDA, 3 of which, according to the way I define it, are multi-specifics. In 2022, there were 38 drug NMEs approved. 8 of those were multi-specific. So it goes from less than 3% to more than 20% in 5 years, right? So massive, massive growth